Hello and welcome back to the Cold Case Project, where we dive into the darkest corners of the criminal mind, exploring the twisted psychology and mental health dynamics that shape some of the most notorious figures in history. Today, we're exploring one of the most infamous killers of the 1980s, Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker. I'll guide you through a scientific lens, piecing together the psychological puzzle behind Ramirez's complex mind. As we navigate through the timeline of his crimes, his troubled background, and what may have driven him to these horrific acts, remember, this isn't a diagnosis, but a speculative exploration into what might have been happening inside the mind of this brutal killer. Please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the Cold Case Project. Richard Ramirez's killing spree stretched from June 1984 to August 1985, but some evidence suggests he may have started even earlier. Known for his erratic methods, Ramirez defied the typical profiles of serial killers. His targets spanned ages, genders, and backgrounds, from young children to elderly individuals. These patterns hint at a deeply disturbed psyche driven by forces beyond simple physical violence. The story begins with a little-known incident on April 10, 1984, when a 9-year-old girl was found murdered in the basement of the hotel where Ramirez was living. Though he wasn't convicted for this crime, his DNA was later matched to the scene, providing an eerie prelude to his brutal career. From there, he continued his rampage, escalating in both frequency and intensity. June 28, 1984. The body of a 79-year-old woman is found, brutally stabbed in her own home. Ramirez left behind a key piece of evidence, a fingerprint on the screen he removed to enter the residence. March 17, 1985. This day was marked by two separate attacks. First, Ramirez shot a young woman, and then in another location, he pulled another victim from her car and shot her twice. Only one victim survived that day. These attacks are just the beginning of the horrific violence that would soon become his signature style. Ramirez's methods were not only sadistic, but seemed to serve a larger purpose within his mind. His belief that he was an agent of Satan fueled his cruelty. He left satanic symbols at many of his crime scenes and openly spoke of his allegiance to the devil.
A deeper look at his upbringing and personal history may shed light on what twisted Ramirez's mind so early in life. Born on February 29, 1960, a leap year baby, an ironic detail, given his unusual nature. He was the youngest of 5 children, raised in an environment fraught with violence and neglect. His mother was exposed to toxic chemicals while pregnant, which may have affected his brain development. From a young age, he experienced a series of traumatic head injuries. At 2 years old, a dresser fell on him, causing a severe head injury and a 15-minute period of unconsciousness. This trauma left him with 30 stitches. 3 years later, another incident involving a swing resulted in another head injury and another period of unconsciousness. These early injuries may have contributed to later neurological issues, and it's known that traumatic brain injuries can alter personality, impulse control, and emotional regulation, factors that often appear in criminal minds. Additionally, in his youth, he began experiencing seizures, leading to a diagnosis of temporal lobe epilepsy, which can sometimes create disinhibition and violent outbursts. Perhaps the most disturbing influence in Ramirez's life was his cousin Mike, a Vietnam War veteran who regularly boasted about the violent acts he committed overseas. Ramirez was a young, impressionable teenager when he first saw graphic photographs Mike had taken of his victims. Mike even taught him skills like stalking and killing without remorse. In 1973, Ramirez watched as his cousin killed his wife during a domestic dispute. Shockingly, this brutal act was dismissed as an episode of insanity, and Mike was released after only a brief stint in a mental hospital. This incident was crucial in shaping Ramirez's attitudes toward violence, showing him that killing didn't necessarily carry severe consequences. By the age of 10, Ramirez had already started exhibiting troubling behaviors. He frequently skipped school, was known to break into neighbors' homes, and developed an obsession with violent imagery. He spent time in cemeteries to escape his father's temper, and by his teenage years, he was sleeping in the local graveyards. This behavior could indicate a deepening fascination with death and the macabre, a precursor to the beliefs that would later fuel his crimes. Ramirez also began experimenting with drugs at a young age, starting with marijuana and quickly moving on to hallucinogens. These substances may have compounded his mental health struggles, lowering his inhibitions and potentially feeding his violent impulses. Drugs, combined with his violent upbringing and traumatic head injuries, created a perfect storm that only needed a spark to ignite. In 1973, Richard Ramirez was a young teenager, still malleable and impressionable, his path not yet fully carved into the shadows. But in that year, he was introduced to a new kind of education, one that would pave the way to the chilling acts he would later commit. His brother Ruben became one of his earliest mentors in crime, teaching him how to open windows from the outside, pick locks, and even disable alarm systems. These weren't the skills of a common thief. They were the building blocks of a career far darker, lessons that would stay with him for life. Around the same time, he moved in with his sister and her husband, attempting to escape the turmoil that his young life had already seen. But this new environment offered him little relief. Instead, from 1973 to 1977, Ramirez began showing signs of behavior that strayed further from society's moral boundaries. He started to break into homes, his early burglaries mere practice for what would later become an insatiable desire for control and violence. His experimentation with substances, which began with marijuana, escalated quickly. Soon, he added hallucinogens, cocaine, and heroin to his list of vices, each one clouding his mind further, distancing him from any sense of consequence or empathy. As if testing society's tolerance, he began to engage with prostitutes and drifted further into a world where boundaries no longer held any meaning. At just 15, he found work in a local hotel, a place that provided him not only with a semblance of normalcy, but also the opportunity to feed his darkening impulses. One day, he entered a guest room uninvited and assaulted a female guest, his first recorded act of violence against a stranger. Her husband returned, catching him in the act, and inflicted a severe beating upon Ramirez. But in a tragic twist of fate, the couple left town before they could testify against him, leaving the justice system unable to hold him accountable. A crucial moment of intervention slipped by unnoticed, allowing Ramirez's behavior to fester unchecked. Other criminal charges eventually caught up with him, leading him to a juvenile detention camp. However, his time there did little to deter him. Upon release, he skipped school frequently, his grades plummeted, and by the time he was 17, he dropped out of high school entirely. That year, in 1977, his cousin Mike, recently released from the hospital, returned to Ramirez's life. Together, they rekindled the connection that had, years earlier, exposed him to violent and traumatic scenes. By the time he was 18, Ramirez had turned to Satanism, adopting beliefs that seemed to justify his impulses and offer him a false sense of power and protection. Between 1978 and 1984, Ramirez's rap sheet expanded. He was arrested multiple times for theft, burglary, and possession, his law-breaking now a way of life. In 1979, he made a decision that, while minor in some people's eyes, became symbolic of his utter disregard for societal norms. He abandoned any semblance of personal hygiene. His outward appearance reflected the decay within, his growing obsession with Satanism convincing him that he was untouchable, protected by dark forces. By 1983, he began openly discussing his belief that Satan was safeguarding him from harm. And soon, he began his most horrifying descent. He started killing. Psychologists would later study Ramirez's psyche in an attempt to diagnose the root of his monstrous acts. The most fitting diagnosis would be antisocial personality disorder, a condition marked by an utter disregard for the rights of others. He embodied nearly every symptom associated with it: habitual law-breaking, pathological lying, impulsivity, aggression, recklessness, irresponsibility, and most disturbingly, a complete lack of remorse. He seemed to thrive on risk, pushing boundaries without fear or hesitation. Ramirez's behavior also aligned closely with psychopathy, showing traits commonly associated with secondary psychopathy or sociopathy. His thrill-seeking nature, parasitic lifestyle, lack of goals, impulsivity, irresponsibility, and criminal versatility made him dangerous in unpredictable ways. He wasn't just a killer, he was a criminal of many trades, equally adept at theft, assault, and burglary as he was at murder. Yet despite his cunning, there were some subtleties of manipulation he lacked. Ramirez wasn't particularly charming, nor did he have the manipulative finesse seen in some psychopaths. His grandiosity, too, was raw and unrefined, his belief in Satan's protection lacking the polish of a true narcissist. Some speculated that he might also have schizoid personality disorder, a condition marked by detachment and emotional coldness. While he did exhibit a preference for solitude, he didn't align completely with the disorder. He seemed to enjoy certain activities, though his pleasures were dark and often self-destructive. His relationships, sparse as they were, didn't fully satisfy his need for connection, but neither did they drive him into isolation. It was as if he was suspended between worlds, never fitting neatly into any one psychological profile. There were also those who thought he might have been delusional, perhaps suffering from a mystic or religious psychosis, evidenced by his belief that Satan was guiding him. But this, too, was murky. Ramirez had used drugs for years, and it was unclear if his so-called visions and beliefs were the result of genuine delusion or simply the hallucinogenic haze of his addiction. His erratic thought patterns may have had more to do with drugs than with an actual break from reality. From the perspective of personality, Ramirez's traits stood out in stark contrast to the average person. In the Big Five model of personality, he scored high in openness to experience, a twisted kind of curiosity that led him to explore every forbidden corner of life. His conscientiousness was as low as it could get, a glaring absence of responsibility. He was introverted to the point of isolating himself from humanity, agreeable only in his willingness to exploit, and neurotic in a way that often manifested as hostility and rage. Yet Ramirez defied many of the patterns seen in other serial killers. Unlike most, he didn't stalk his victims or choose them with precision. He was more of an opportunist, picking houses based on ease of entry rather than targeting specific people. He left traces of himself everywhere, seemingly unconcerned with being caught. Yet paradoxically, he meticulously wiped down stolen cars, removing fingerprints when he stole vehicles to escape from crime scenes. It was ultimately one of these fingerprints, left behind in a careless moment, that led to his arrest. The weapons he chose varied as widely as his victims, ranging from firearms and knives to improvised items like a lamp, a hammer, a telephone cord, and even a machete. Unlike other serial killers who develop a ritual, a pattern of killing, Ramirez used whatever was at hand. He didn't limit his victims to a particular age or type. Anyone who crossed his path and offered a window of opportunity became fair game. Fueled by a relentless anger and a raging drug addiction, he moved from one victim to another, sometimes killing multiple people in a single night. Ramirez was, in many ways, a creature of randomness, yet his attacks left behind a clear message: terror, brutality, and destruction. His reign of terror sent shockwaves through the communities he targeted. Families fortified their homes with locks, alarm systems, and firearms, yet somehow he managed to slip past them time and time again. His relentless crime spree ended only when a fingerprint finally tied him to his crimes. As one judge would later remark, Ramirez's actions represented cruelty, callousness, and viciousness beyond human understanding. In the end, Ramirez's journey was a tragic tapestry of violence, neglect, and missed opportunities. From toxic chemicals that may have affected him even before birth to traumatic head injuries and exposure to his cousin Mike's graphic war stories, Ramirez's childhood was a perfect storm of damaging experiences. He had witnessed more brutality by his teens than most people see in a lifetime. By 13, he had seen his cousin kill a woman, and that haunting memory would mark the beginning of a path that led only to darkness. Throughout his life, society failed him at critical moments. He was a young boy who desperately needed intervention. Yet each time, the opportunity slipped through the cracks. A victim of a broken system, he went on to shatter lives across the state, his rage leaving an unfillable void in the lives of countless victims and their families. His was a story not only of a killer, but also of the societal failures that helped shape him. And in that realization lies perhaps the most chilling truth of all. His life was a series of preventable tragedies that, at every turn, went unheeded.
That brings us to the end of our look into the life and crimes of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. I know this video is a bit of a departure from the usual content on the Cold Case Project. Normally we dive into unsolved mysteries, but I wanted to take a closer look at what can lead a person down such a dark path. Ramirez's story is a haunting example of how certain life events, combined with the wrong influences, can shape someone in ways that are hard to comprehend. It's unsettling, but understanding the psychology behind it can sometimes shed light on patterns we might otherwise miss. If you found this type of analysis interesting, let me know in the comments. Maybe we can explore more criminal psychology in the minds of some of history's darkest figures. As always, thank you for watching. If you haven't already, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any upcoming videos. Take care, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.